Introductory words spoken before a Eurythmy performance, Dornach, April 15, 1923. Once again, we would like to try to give you an impression of Eurythmy. None of all these movements and gestures should be looked upon as arbitrary or fortuitous, for they are intended to convey a definite visible language or visible music. This is the reason why Eurythmy is accompanied either by recitation and declamation, as in the case of poetry, or by various kinds of music. During the course of life, a human being progresses from the first babbling sounds of babyhood, which express only feelings and sensations in primitive form, to the articulated speech of later stages. In a similar way, it is also possible to progress from the primitive and natural gestures, babbling gestures I should like to call them, made in ordinary life, to lend clarity, emphasis, or feelings to the spoken word, to a visible form of speech, brought about by the movements of the entire human organism. And so, what you are about to see on the stage does not rest upon artificially contrived movements, but is based upon an exact and careful study, according to Goethe's method of what he called sensible supersensible beholding, of how the spoken word and human song come into being. For in this case, too, one has to do with a kind of gesturing. This form of gesturing, however, does not take place within the ordinary visible human organism, but within the outflowing breath. Naturally, the breath is always directed, partly by human will forces, aided by the relevant physical organs, and partly by human thinking. We know that in speaking, air is set into motion. If we studied in detail the forms of these air movements by means of which human beings communicate with one another, we should find that a definite flow form of the outstreaming air corresponds to each sound, to each word figuration, and to the configuration of each sentence. Air forms flowing out more radially from a speaking person issue from the region of the human will, of course always through the agency of physical organs, as already mentioned. Sounds that shape these air gestures into waves of a more cross-sectional type, if I may use such a term, stem from human thinking. If we could see these gestures of moving air as we can see the human being in motion, and this is possible through sensible supersensible beholding, we should have before us a kind of aeriform image of the human being, or at least of part of the human being. And within this image we would see movement of flowing air. It is these air movements which are being studied carefully, but instead of letting the larynx and the other speech organs transform the air gestures into speech or song, they are turned into gestures performed by the arms, by the hands, or by the entire human figure, also by groups of eurythmists moving in definite patterns. Through this arrangement, what is happening in ordinary speech or song has now been made visible, the only difference being that the thought element has been left out of these movements. The thought element always tends to be inartistic and prosaic. In order to express themselves artistically through the medium of language, poets have to struggle against the thought element. They have to wrest away from the thought sphere what language offers to them. In a certain way they try to loosen the thoughts from language, retaining only its will element, which they use in order to express their soul experiences. In making the appropriate eurythmy movements that accompany the spoken word, a unique opportunity is given for bringing to outer expression, clearly and visibly, what the poets have been experiencing within their souls. To believe that human souls and spirits are linked to any particular part of the physical body surely amounts to some kind of prejudice, for in reality the human soul completely permeates the entire organism, right into the outermost parts of the periphery. It lives in all that is outwardly expressed, in every physical manifestation. Poets experience the content of a poem with their entire being, but strictly speaking, they have to hold back what wants to flow into their limbs. Admittedly, there are only a few poets who really go through this experience. I think that one could safely say that of all that is being produced in the art of poetry, some 99% could well be left out of account without incurring too great a loss in the artistic field. But any deeply experienced poetry is experienced by the totality of the human being, and then soul and spirit are pouring into the entire being of the individual concerned. What a poet tries to achieve through the imaginative, the formative pictorial qualities of sound formation, or through the element of rhythm and beat, and also through the musical and thematic treatment of sound production, all this is basically achieved by letting the prose content of the words recede, while giving voice to what is truly poetical and artistic. Consequently, if the art of recitation is to do justice to a poet's work, it must not lay the main emphasis upon the prose meaning, something that has become all too popular in our inartistic age, but it should concentrate on the way in which the spoken word is formed. This has been striven for in the art of recitation, which is being cultivated here, and to which Frau Dr. Steiner has devoted herself for some considerable time. If the meaning of the spoken word is stressed in recitation, the result will be prose in essence. Though this may appear interesting and intriguing, because, so one believes, the personality of the reciter will then be in the limelight, it nevertheless remains inartistic. The artistic approach lies in the speaker's ability to bring out various qualities, such as passionate feelings, emotions, and in the case of thoughts, the communication of the thoughts themselves, by means of the pictorial element and the plasticity of the sounds as they follow one another, and also through the way in which diverse sound nuances mutually affect each other. It cannot be achieved by concentrating on content alone. If a thought is to be expressed poetically, the form of the thought has to be toned down. The poetic quality of language has to be looked for solely in the way speech is formed. Apart from the image-creating quality and the plasticity of speech, the essence of recitation is found equally in its musical, beat-directed, and rhythmical aspects. In prose, verses are obviously out of place, but in poetry there is every need for them, for they offer a kind of meeting ground, which, with its rhythmical and musical qualities, is of fundamental importance in speech. And so in the work of a genuine poet, we already find a hidden eurythmy in the way in which language is treated. Hence there is nothing artificial, in fact only something entirely natural in eurythmy, bringing to outer manifestation what the true poet has suppressed, at least to a certain extent. Poets want to place into the world, with their entire being, what they bring down into earthly incarnation. But being restricted to the medium and use of language, they must artificially restrain certain aspects of what they desire to express with the fullness of their humanity. All this is again released on being transmuted into a visual expression through the agency of eurythmy. Hearing the speaker's recitation, while at the same time seeing the soul and spiritual counterpart, which ordinarily flows into the spoken word, in the movements of the performing eurythmists, one receives a direct picture of the full poetic experience. To make this inherent poetic experience visible through movement, quote, painted into space, unquote, this is what eurythmy really wants to achieve.